how good of hand do we need to, bet and expect to be beating his calling range. Sometimes it's a really, really weak range, a really wide value range that includes, jacks, queens, kings on an ace-high board, ace deuce, obviously. Maybe stuff is, weak as king, queen high, like the nut high cards. Like, it depends on the opponent. But you're merging either way. So that's just good to know. So here we go. I just want to take a moment to talk about the super dry Jack XX board. It's important to note how this changes. Basically, you have something even less because you're playing a lot of ace X hands that you don't play in the Jack XX form. Like if you open ace deuce suited in middle position in the 6-max game, you likely don't open Jack X suited or Jack deuce suited in the same situation. So there's a lot of combos of ace X that you're not going to have Jack X, right? And all that means is basically that both you and your opponent are likely hitting this board even less, but it doesn't change any of the logic really. So. Super wet flops. The flop, has a straight draw, it has a flush draw. Basically, everyone's continuing range is naturally wider, or at least a higher frequency, because a lot of hands hit these flops. Their hand strength is generally going to be much higher than if they, float with the same frequency on a dry flop, but their frequency still goes up, as does the average hand ranking, and that's just because it's natural. And equity lines are generally closer together, pair plus flush draw, 2 pair plus, sets, combo draws, like, all this stuff is basically going to line up against each other and create ranges that are like 40, 60, 50, 50, Alright, so against the first player, we're playing against the young internet pro. He's not folding an exploitable amount because his range is generally... we can't really bluff with complete air. But he does semi-bluff his draws, and he raises 2 pair plus, and he calls much less frequently than he raises. This is because he's semi-bluffing. A lot of his hands are going to be pair plus flush draw, pair plus straight draw, combo draw. Like, if he's just calling with those, then, he's not semi-bluffing as much. So because of that, a lot of his hands are in that semi-bluffing category. So what he does with those semi-bluffs basically defines him as a player on this board. So even though we're not betting our air, we're going to have, it's not really a polarized range, it's a merged range. I think that was kind of a typo. But we're betting with, basically we're going to mirror his play. Against the internet pro, we want to bet with a range of like 2 pair plus, draws, and then we want to either check call or check fold, like weak 1 pair hands. We might be able to bet fold a lot of our 1 pair hands, depending on his like fold frequency and his calling frequency. But it's just they're going to be very difficult to play, and you're generally going to be bet folding them. It might just yield a lesser loss if we check fold, like ace 10 on that board, or it might yield a higher profit if we check call ace queen. It all depends on his preflop range, how it lines up with the board. It's just a really wide area of shade of gray. So this player is just going to make every hand difficult to play, basically, and we're going to try and mirror his play as best as we can by doing pretty much the exact same thing. Player 2 is a really terrible live player. He clearly knows everything about poker and believes that he shouldn't raise when he has the worst hand. So he's not folding an exploitable amount because, again, everyone has a good hand. But he's not semi-bluffing his draws. He's only raising 2 pair plus, right? Because he's got to protect, right? He calls much more frequently than he raises, obviously, because he's calling with his semi-bluffs, the hands that the other player semi-bluffed. So against this player, we want to merge our range and bet fold everything. We're still not betting air because his range is too strong, but now we can bet all those middling equity hands and bet fold them very comfortably. So like ace queen, ace 10, we don't have to bet shove, bet call. We don't have the same pressures as we had against the guy who's going to semi-bluff. We're not going to have the same ambiguity. When this guy raises, we're beat. When the internet pro raises, we are winning sometimes, we're losing sometimes, and the issue is that all that put together creates a range that if we stacked off against him, we're losing a lot of money. But against this guy, he's not abusing that concept. So now we can bet all those middling equity hands and expect to bet fold them, a decent portion of the time when he raises with 2 pair plus, but expect to get called a much higher frequency. He's going to call with all his worst pairs. He's going to call with all the flush draws that we beat. So we might as well bet them for value and, not miss a chance for, free money. Right. So I want to take a moment to talk about backdoor equity, and it's basically a small edge that you can gain when, you're structuring your air ranges. there are different tiers of air, and there's some air that will improve on occasion, and there's some air that just, has no equity whatsoever. So like on the ace XX rainbow board, let's say ace deuce 2 rainbow, 8-7 or 8-6 suited, right? Or 8-9 suited, same hand pretty much in this scenario. There are two different cards that will come to give us an open-ended straight draw and allow us to double barrel with a decent frequency. It's going to be like 20% of the time when we hold those hands. Plus there's, well, not 20% on the straight draw, but if you add the straight draw plus the flush draw that can come with 3 of the combos, so like ace XX, ace 7 deuce, we have 8-9, so any 10 and any 6 is going to give us an open-ended straight draw, and then with 3 of those combos of 8-9 suited, we're going to get a flush draw on the turn, because there's only 3 suits on the board. So if we have like the ace of hearts, the 7 of clubs, and the deuce of diamonds, then 8-9 of hearts is going to get a heart on the turn about 20% of the time. So we can c-bet that before any 8-9 combo that doesn't have a backdoor flush draw, or any hand that doesn't have any flush draw, like 8-9 offsuit or something like that, or king 8 offsuit. So think about your backdoor equity and how the hand might develop on the turn and river, basically, when you're structuring like the tiers of your air. And remember that it doesn't necessarily mean like, yeah, it's not much of an equity boost overall, like having 8-9 suited on an ace 7 deuce rainbow board. But the fold equity gained on the 20% of the time that we can double barrel on a backdoor draw is way more important. Like, it's not that that extra couple percent really makes a big difference, or 1% or whatever. But what is important is the fact that you can double barrel with a decent frequency, and that's going to make a big difference in the way a hand develops. And then also the dry flop that will eventually get wet almost every time. The flop 10-6-3 rainbow, for example, or 10-6-4 rainbow, it's pretty wide. Our opponent's it's pretty dry, and our opponent's going to float it a very substantial portion of the time. Like, you're going to see people float this board with like ace jack high, ace 8 high, but on the turn, it's just suddenly going to get wet very often. If it doesn't pair the board, it does something. 4-5 is going to bring some kind of straight draw, or complete some kind of straight draw, or make it very likely that it's going to be 4 to a straight on the river, and we can represent the straight. 7, 8, 9, same thing. A jack is going to make king, queen an open-ended straight draw, make jack X or queen jack top pair. Same thing with a queen, basically, and a king. So remember, like, these boards, when you c-bet them, you should be able to follow through a ton. So I like to c-bet these boards with a higher frequency, like, even than like ace XX rainbow. But when the ace XX rainbow turn comes, there's not many turns that I'm really going to want to double barrel unless I have a value hand. But on this board, there's a bunch of turns that I can represent hands and actually have backdoor equity and top pair now or something like that. So, when you c-bet this board, you should be double barreling a very high frequency. Gray areas. Obviously, we just talked about polar extremes. You want to take what we just talked about in terms of figuring out your opponent's range and whether or not he's raising very often, calling very often, folding very often, and how that affects how you should structure your range in terms of your, like, what you define as a value bet, what you define as an inducing check or something like that, and then what you define as air on that board, and whether you should polarize, merge. All these things can be applied across the board, not just on the flop, but pre-flop, on the turn. It's just use this stuff. Apply these general logic patterns to navigating new spots. Even if you don't agree with some of it, I mean, it's just another way to look at the game. And I've found it incredibly useful in terms of navigating new spots as they come up, figuring out what my opponents are thinking, level warring, and adjusting to my opponent's plays. I just think it simplifies the game a lot. So I hope you guys found this helpful, and good luck at the tables.